Hey, what's going on everyone, and I'm back again for another Rising of the Overlord Season 4 episode breakdown. So, once again, the Volume 11 content, we are just blasting through the light novel at this point. I mean, it feels like we are, because once again, this episode contained over a chapter's worth of content. But overall, this episode focused on Ainz' establishment with the Dwarf Kingdom, meeting the dwarves, and basically solidifying the deal for having the runesmiths come to the Sorcerer Kingdom in exchange for Ainz helping them out with the demi-human problem. So guys, actually, I was wondering if we were going to get this scene or not in the anime, and it turns out we're not. But in the light novel, there is actually an intermission chapter in the middle of the volume where these events are taking place right now, and it actually takes place in the Elf Country. The Elf Country is not a country that we have seen in the anime at all, and this intermission basically talks about the ongoing war between the Slain Theocracy and the Elf Country, and it's from the perspective of the Elf King. And the Elf King is not a good ruler. He's extremely self-centered. He doesn't really care about the country he rules at all. All he cares about is strength, and this is where we learn that the Elf King is actually the father of Zeshi, who is the extra seat of the Black Scripture in the Slain Theocracy. And basically, during this whole intermission chapter, we find out that the war with the Slain Theocracy in the Elf Country is going extremely poorly. The Slain Theocracy just outclasses the Elf Country basically in every military aspect. The only reason the Elf Country has held on even at all is because they're engaging in guerrilla warfare, but that isn't working too well now because the Slain Theocracy sent in the Firestorm Scripture, and the Firestorm Scripture is their guerrilla warfare units, so things are just going really bad for the elves at this point. But the Elf King doesn't care. It's actually stated that he sent his kids out onto the front lines in order to forcefully awaken their strength, but it didn't work and they all died, but he doesn't really care. So that scene was entirely removed from the anime. I can understand why they removed it though, because it has really nothing to do with what's going on in the anime right now at this point, and we don't get into the Elf Country really in depth until the most recent volumes 15 and 16, so it makes sense that they probably wouldn't include that in the anime, but I just thought it was interesting to include. So this episode starts off with that scene between the Guagoa fighting the dwarves, and this just goes to show you that the dwarves are at a vast military disadvantage. In the light novels, it's elaborated on that there is a fortress around the Grand Chasm, which is that giant pit that you saw in this episode, and basically the problem is that the dwarves were complacent about the fortress because it was surrounded by the Grand Chasm. They didn't think there was any way they could pierce through it because it's so well defended. However, the Guagoa have just come in with such numbers that they completely overwhelmed the Dwarven defenses, and they've had to fall back to their other defensive line. And something that's shown here in the anime, but it wasn't actually explained, is that Guagoa are actually extremely weak to electric type attacks. So that's why they were using electric spells against the Guagoa when they were coming in. And also something that's shown in the anime, but I don't think it's really explained all that well, is just how desperate the situation is for the dwarves. They are vastly outnumbered at this point by the Guagoa, and they really don't have any way to stop them from taking over the city at this point. They would have to evacuate. But then, of course, we have the arrival of Bone Daddy himself to save the day. Once again, like has happened many times in this season so far, Ainz just shows up right at the perfect time to maximize his outputs. So Ainz shows up to offer the dwarves some help with the Guagoa, and during this scene in the light novel, there's a really huge distrust between the dwarves and Ainz. They eventually relent, like shown in the anime, but in the light novel, it's a longer scene because the dwarves really do not trust Ainz because he's an undead. And this really just goes to show you that the humanoid races of the world really do not trust Ainz. In the new world, it's a little weird because humans basically view all their kind of cousin races, which are the elves, the half-elves, the dwarves. They view them as demi-humans or subhumans basically. But in Yggdrasil terms, humans, dwarves, and elves are all classified under the human race. So it's a little weird, but basically the humanoid races have a deep distrust and dislike of undead, so this whole interaction with Ainz is seen as extremely weird to them. So moving on, we have that scene with the Death Knights runesmiths being sent out to attack the Guagoa, which I thought was really cool. I thought they animated it well, because in the light novel, you know, it's supposed to be a very gory scene. It's violent, and this scene is relatively faithful to the light novel. It's always cool to see action scenes adapted from the light novel in an anime format. I always get really excited whenever there's an action scene like that, because I can finally see it being brought to life. So there's actually one thing that's mentioned by the Guagoa. I believe his name is Yozu, who was the commander of the Guagoa forces during the attack, and he mentions Lord Ryuro, and Lord Ryuro is actually the leader of the Guagoa. We're gonna see more from him later on, so I'm not gonna go too deep into him because I don't want to spoil anything, but you should know he is the leader of the Guagoa. So then we have the meeting between Ainz and the Regency Council, which is the ruling party of the Dwarf Kingdom. And really a funny thing that's elaborated on in the light novel that they don't show in the anime is that during this whole conversation, Ainz is so nervous. He is so worried about saying the wrong thing and like his image and how he presents himself. He's so concerned about that the whole time. That just goes to show you once again that Ainz is having to fake a lot of his charisma, and his nature as an undead really helps with that since he doesn't show emotion. And there's actually one thing I remember in how the dwarves are kind of distrusting like Ainz's offers because it seems too good. Ainz actually draws a comparison to Yggdrasil, and he brings up the top-ranked guild in Yggdrasil, which I believe was called Seraphim. And according to Ainz's dialogue in the light novel, Seraphim was the top-ranked guild in Yggdrasil, and it consisted of entirely angel-like characters. So the negotiations start happening, and a portion of the negotiations that isn't included in the light novel is Ainz offering to provide the undead as labor force for excavating the ores. And there's this whole kind of conversation about them being really nervous about bringing in undead, because even though the undead would work great as a labor force, they don't get tired, you don't have to pay them, you don't have to feed them, you know, whatever. It's just that the humanoid races, especially the priest who was there, I think he was the head priest of Earth, they just have a natural fear of the undead because they believe the undead hate the living and want to kill the living. So there's this whole conversation with Ainz trying to convince them like, hey, don't worry about the undead, like I'm their master, they'll listen to me, but like they still don't really trust Ainz. So it's this kind of weird back and forth. Found that really interesting in the light novel. I just liked to see this whole geopolitical kind of thing going on. And there's actually another thing that Ainz wants in the light novel, and this was omitted from the anime, but he wants to give Zaryusu, one of the lizard men, a gift to celebrate the birth of his child, and also basically he's kind of excited over the prospect of them making more, him and Crush making more white-scaled lizard men. So he decides to conscript the Forge Master dwarf to make a set of armor, and this is where Ainz tries to find out like what kind of ores are available in the new world. And I remember this line very specifically because it was just kind of funny for me to read, but he was waiting for their response, and if they had said some prismatic ores, which are like really rare ores that were found in Yggdrasil, Ainz just said he was going to end the negotiations and take over the Dwarf Kingdom by force because he wants those ores right now. But they ended up saying like adamantite was like the hardest metal they had, and Ainz was like, oh, that's fodder. Because he still wants armor, he like pulls out this ingot of level 45 metal, and I remember that the Forge Master was like, what is this? And Ainz almost said it's worthless because it's level 45, and that to him that's nothing. I just find it funny because to a level 100 guy, all these items that Ainz keeps throwing out in the new world, they're all trash items that mean nothing to him. But to the new worlders, they're like god tier, like freaking nukes, and I just love that aspect. It's funny to me. So then we move on to the plan where they are going to retake the royal capital. And when talking about the royal capital, this is where we learn a little bit about what's going on with the Guagoa there. And from what's explained in the light novel, apparently the dynamic is that the frost dragons are actually the ones that command the Guagoa. The Guagoa are this numerous big tribe, but the dragons are just, you know, way stronger. So basically the Guagoa are subservient to the frost dragons, and we are going to be introduced to them a little bit later on, so I'm going to save diving real deep into the frost dragons until they're actually shown in the anime, but that just gives you an idea of the general structure of what's going on and what the hell the frost dragons are actually doing with the Guagoa. But anyway, they cut out the debate that happened between the Regency Council after Ainz left, and they were at first going to reject the proposal, but then the commander-in-chief basically told them like, hey, we are going to all die without his help. Like, we're gonna lose the kingdom. So in the light novel, we actually get a better idea of the Dwarven cities. And originally there were 4 Dwarven cities. There's Feoburcanen, which is the royal capital, and that apparently was abandoned over 200 years ago during the Demon Gods era. And that's now where the Frost Dragons live, as well as a main group of Gwagoa. And then there's Feogera, which is where they are currently living. And then there was Feorido, which was another city that had been abandoned several years ago. There's Feotiwaz, which was a city that actually was destroyed by a fight between 2 different Frost Dragons. So they're down to their last city at this point. So things are desperate, so that's why they have nowhere else to go. If they're driven out of Feogera, that's it. So through that logic, they decided to take up Ainz on his offer, and now we're going on this mission to eliminate the Frost Dragons and Gwagoa from Feoburcanen, the capital. We then have that scene between Ainz and the runesmiths of Feogera, and they're all gathering at Gondo's house, and they had all been bribed to come there because Ainz basically gave Gondo all these little bottles of wine to hand out because dwarves love alcohol. And I have to be honest, I have always loved the characterization of dwarves in fiction. A prime example is like Lord of the Rings. Like, dwarves are so entertaining and just the way they act in Lord of the Rings, and that's why I just like dwarves in fictional fantasy kind of settings like this. But the dwarves show up because they want more of that good old booze, and that's where Ainz does the presentation. And actually, I think this is an anime-only scene where Shaltir basically cuts off Ainz. Ainz was about to do that so noisy, like that pose he worked on in season 3, but Shaltir cut him off, and I think he was like a little like, man, I was about to do my pose. I don't remember that in the light novel, so that might have been an anime-only thing that I thought was really funny. So Ainz shows him that sword from Yggdrasil with the 20 runes on it. And something I feel like I need to explain is that runecraft as it works in the New World was not a system in Yggdrasil. Or at least Ainz doesn't think it was. There might have been data for it, but it was like not discovered until the end of the Yggdrasil server. So while the concept of runes did exist in Yggdrasil, there was no like rune crafting system that was used actively by players in Yggdrasil. And so that's why Ainz was able to have like those 20 runes on his sword, because they're only cosmetic. They don't actually have any real effect. But he used that sword as a way to, I guess, trick them, really is really no other way to put it, and motivate them to work and strive for this new ideal. And there's also that mention of that hammer with the 6 runes on it, who I believe in the light novel it's stated that that was actually made by Gondo's grandfather, and it was actually wielded by one of the 13 heroes 200 years ago. I believe it was called Magic Craftsman. Yeah, he was the king of the dwarves, and he was a member of the 13 heroes that fought against the demon gods 200 years ago in the New World timeline. So we have them exiting, and this is where Ainz kind of sees what went down with his undead and why they were killed. And this whole time that the Death Knights have been killed, Ainz has been kind of worried about that, because he keeps running through the possibility of it being a player, like a super strong player that wiped out the Death Knights. Like, he was actually freaking out about this, and he was worried, like, is this the same person that targeted Shaltir? And actually, something in the light novel that's brought up a lot is every time Ainz thinks about like what went down with Shaltir, he gets super pissed off. Like, there's actually this whole scene in the light novel where Ainz just basically disregards equality because he doesn't view all life as equal. He says in his mind that the Nazaric NPCs are 2 or 3 rungs above literally everyone else in the world. So once again, this is showing you Ainz's personality in that he's not unnecessarily cruel when he doesn't have to be. If he had to do that, he would have no problem wiping out tens of millions of people if it meant keeping Nazaric safe. He has no issue with doing that. So basically, don't poke this guy or you will wake up his gamer rage. And as we have seen before, gamer rage is a very potent force. And then we end with that little scene with Ainz thinking back to Nina in season 1, and I actually completely forgot this. Now, I have actually gone back and watched several episodes in season 1, probably maybe a dozen times in the 4 years since season 3. But honestly, those episodes with the Swords of Darkness and Momon and Nabe just going around with them, I don't particularly like those episodes. So I actually have probably watched those the least out of all the episodes of season 1. So I don't remember that scene at all, but I was like, holy crap, he's actually thinking about Nina. And this is actually the second time he's thought about Nina Ninya, and I just thought that was really interesting because actually in the light novel, it's been established that it's been almost a year now since Ainz has been transported to the new world, and Ninya is one of the first people that he met. But like he still, you know, remembers those things, and like those events did have an impact on him and have impacted a lot of his actions. Like the whole thing with Tuare, the reason he helped out Tuare is because of her being Ninya's older sister. So really that wasn't something like super important. I just thought it was really neat that we're getting that throwback. So guys, that pretty much wraps up the episode, and overall I really enjoyed it as usual. Once again, really the big thing about the difference between the light novel and the anime is just the amount of internal dialogue we get from Ainz. It almost seems like in the anime we're kind of getting like the perspective of Ainz from like a third party, like viewing him, because in the light novel it's first person most of the time, and so we get to hear Ainz's inner dialogue and his inner thoughts. It kind of humanizes Ainz as a narrator, but in the anime, you know, we don't get any of that, so he just comes across as like this super smart undead, and he's like figuring it out. We don't really get all this internal turmoil. We get some of it, but we don't get nearly as much as we get in the light novel, and I do think that's kind of an interesting viewpoint shift between the anime and light novel. It does differentiates the two and kind of gives you different storytelling based on what medium you're watching and reading. But guys, basically this is setting it up for the big conflict of this volume, which is between the dwarves and Ainz against the frost dragons and the Guagoa. Well, we're getting into the climax of the Craftsman of the Dwarves arc, which I'm just really excited for. So once again, another great episode of Overlord, just letting us explore this world more and learn more about this amazing universe that Maruyama has created. So guys, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I want to hear what your thoughts on the episode were in the comment section below. Thank you all for watching to the very end of the episode, and I will see you all next time. Bye!